Hi everybody. You can all see Alister on the screen. He can't see any of us. It's a really great situation to be in. We'll kick off a little bit early since he's here and we're here and everything has happened really well. As I said before, we're going to run this session straight away and then we'll go into the notices and all that sort of part of the rest of the proceedings at the conclusion of this. So I'm going to take the opportunity to introduce Alister, and basically how this happened is we were introduced to Alister by John Benn. Maybe his cousin, maybe not. I don't know. John says that they weren't related, but he'd actually had been doing some work with John. So you will remember when John Benn arrived at CPS 4 or 5 years ago, before he disappeared up to the North Island, his first year here, he was putting some stunning pictures up, and he went straight from C grade to A grade in a flash, and then he went and applied for his honours and got it in a flash. And one of the things that I think we note about this is that John's work was really, all his images told a story. They were all expressive. They all said something. And when I talked to John about it, he said, I've been doing this course with this amazing guy in the UK, and so I went and had a watch of some of Alister's YouTubes, and they're pretty cool. And I can see how it worked. And so the expressive photography that comes from Alister really worked with John. I went and had a look yesterday actually on your website, Alister, and it talked, you introduced yourself by saying that you've been teaching landscape photography for a number of years. I don't think that's even the half of it from the YouTube clips that I've seen. And I found something else on your website which I think for me sums it up better. And I'm going to quote you. In there you said, photography for me is a catalyst. Each image is a snapshot of my own inner landscape. It's not always pretty, but it is me. And really, I think that's the key that I'm looking forward to hearing tonight, is that little bit of the inside of what really goes on in Alister Benn's expressive photography. He said in the email the other day that he's going to give an inspiring presentation to set folks on fire. I can't wait. I'm really looking forward to it. So over to you.
Well, good evening, good morning. It's not quite 9 o'clock here on the Isle of Lewis on the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. Beautiful part of the world, but I do have fond memories of my time in New Zealand. The last time I was there was 2010, and I passed through Christchurch, doing lots of albatross photography off Kaikoura and stuff like that. But I do hope to get back one day. My wife hasn't been, so we do hope to come back to New Zealand at some point in time. But God, it's such a long way. So yes, what I'll do is I have a keynote presentation that I'm going to deliver to you this evening. I don't know if I said in the email that it was going to be motivating and inspiring, or whether that was what the request was. So you can determine that at the end. Now, I haven't used Google Meets or Teams or whatever it's called before, so I'm guessing that Present Now button is what I should be doing.
Down the bottom, you'll need to open a separate window with your
I've got
thing on it. Yeah, so if you go to Present, it'll there you go.
So dismiss, and so if I now go to keynote, so can you see that full screen?
Yep. Well, it's not
cool.
quite full screen.
Right.
We can see you, and we can see Alister's knee, our Alister's knee. So we got the two windows on the side. We might be able to get. Can you delete those, Alister?
Let me see. I'll stop sharing, and then entire screen. That's what we want to do. Whoa.
Whoa!
Right, do you have a
stick
screen
with
now?
that, and we'll see if we can get rid of the pictures at our end. Can you do that?
So can you see the presentation?
Not now, he just minimised it. We're working on it. The presentation with Alister beside it's okay. Just leave them there, it's fine, just go with it the way it was.
As long as the presentation is big enough that you can see the... No one wants to look at me at this time in the morning.
Yep, we can see you and we can see the presentation, so just go.
Okay, right, so we'll go with this then. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm always very humble about these things. I don't like people talking about my work particularly, which is not a great trait for a landscape photographer. Right, so expressive photography is a bit of a catch-all term for the philosophy and the way I approach photography. So what we'll do is we will start with a little bit of a summary in terms of who am I. And there's a very superficial level to that, which is I'm Scottish, fiercely proud of it. And I am a fellow of the Royal Photographic Society since 2011, which I guess is a bit of a big smell over here in the UK. I run a company called Express Photography with my beautiful Norwegian wife, Ann-Christine. And I basically wander around pointing my camera at stuff that I like, that I think is cool, that attracts my attention, that just basically speaks to me in some way. It's not complicated. So what I hope to share with you this evening is how I came to be where I am, because photography can take over or it can manifest itself in any number of ways. And one of the things that I'm really keen to try and express is that what's the most important thing about photography is it the camera you use or the lenses that you use or the landscapes that you go into or the processing that you do. Well, no, it's none of those things. It's you. It's the person behind the camera that is the main event. Everything else is just a way of expressing ourselves. Now, if I ask a question, who am I really? That is a far deeper and more personal story. So I've said for many, many years now, in fact, back in 2013, I think it was, I had to write a eulogy for one of my friends who'd passed away. Very young, he was in his 40s, unfortunately died of cancer. And I remember at the time writing that our lives are an empty book filled with pages, and it's our life's work to fill them. And at the end of the day, that's what our lives are, is a number of empty pages in front of us, and it's our exciting adventure to fill them. And I want my book to be filled with love and passion and excitement and adventure and maybe a little bit of romance. A little bit of snuggling from time to time is always good, you know, but to fill it with passion. And that is what our books are. And as photographers, how lucky are we to be able to illustrate our books with these fabulous images as well as the stories that we are having. So once you start looking at your life in that manner, and as a photographer, you're illustrating your book, then all of a sudden the photographs seem to have a little bit more significance. And they can be quiet, introspective, personal photographs, or they can be big, grand, majestic landscapes of which you have an abundance down south over where you are. So that seems to me like a bit of a gift for us. But you need to appreciate it. You know, it's the same as all gifts. If you don't appreciate them, then you just take them for granted. To backtrack somewhat, where my story began, I was born in the city of Glasgow, but we left there when I was, before I was a teenager. I was about 11 or 12 years old. And we moved up into the Highlands of Scotland to a little village surrounded by forests and mountains and rivers. And it was really, really beautiful. I had this very idyllic childhood, running around these woods with sticks, pretending to be Aragorn, and chasing orcs in my mind. And definitely believed in fairies and elves and trolls and goblins and all of that type of thing. So I always had a somewhat inquisitive imagination, you could say, which made me a difficult child, I suppose. My mother was never quite sure where I was or what trouble I was getting into. But I felt I had a very strong and passionate love for the landscape. I got my first camera when I think it was my 13th birthday. I got a little Olympus OM10, and I used to wander around pointing it at things I thought were cool. I didn't know anything about f-stops or apertures or depth of field or shutter speeds or ASAs of the film. I just didn't know any of that. I just pointed it at stuff I thought was cool. And some of those photographs I still really like. I mean, oddly, I still have them. And some of them I look at and think, yeah, I'd have taken that today. So I kind of felt in my innocent naivete of being a child that I kind of had a good attitude towards photography. To quote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, life, don't talk to me about life. Of course, when you're a teenager, there's any number of distractions of a soft and fluffy persuasion that prevent you from running around the landscape with a camera. And instead, you get into all sorts of other things. I became a really passionate rock climber. I went off to university. And then, of course, you leave uni and you realize that you have to get a wife, a mortgage, 2 cars, and have 2 weeks of vacation every year. And you kind of get onto that corporate ladder. By the end of 1990s, sort of late 1990, I think it was like 98 or 99, I left my job in the UK. I was in finance in the UK. I was working for a bank. Which was not very exciting. And I ended up moving to the Far East, and I had a house in Borneo. I lived in Sarawak. I used to work in Brunei and Thailand and Malaysia. And I went to China in 2000, and that started a love affair with China that kind of lasted for at least the next 10 to 13 years, maybe a little longer than that, 10 to 15 years. And this was the view from my office. This was an office that I had in a little village called Lijiang, down in Yunnan province, which is right on the southwest of China. And I lived there on and off for about 10 years, very close to Tibet, and actually lived in Tibet itself for quite a while as well. But this was the view from my office window. So I used to wake up in the morning and open the blinds, and this is what I looked out to. It only ever did that once. Those crazy lenticular clouds. I thought, oh my God, this is going to be the best office ever. And it never, ever, ever quite got that good again. But I did get to travel all over China. This is from the rice terraces in the south, very close to the Vietnamese border. So that moving out to the Far East was such a huge catalyst for me to go and explore the world and to experience different cultures. And I was a fanatical birder. So it was this lifelong love of birds that really got me back into photography. I decided to really dive into bird photography in a really passionate way. And it's difficult, especially back then before the Nikon Z8 came out, and it's basically cheating. These are all old lenses and old DSLR cameras. I think most of these were taken with a Canon 1DS. So this is back in about 2003, 2004. And little Anna's hummingbird there on the left-hand side, one of the most precious little jewels. This is an American bird, west coast of the US. And then just common gulls up on the right-hand side there, and then swallows. So, the passion and the dedication to photograph birds with equipment of the day, that wasn't as good as it is today, it teaches you a lot of craft. And I think my personality was very much, I could go down the craft route quite readily, but likewise, I always felt I wanted to do more. I felt that creativity was a really big part of expression. So long before expressive photography was born, I think I understood the power of photography as an expressive medium. The photograph on the left there is the product of 30 days cycling about 30 kilometers in the morning with all of this gear on my back, and a big tripod and a Wimberley head and stuff, and cycling all over these hills and stuff to get to this mud flat where these stilts used to come on certain times of the day, certain tides, and to get one first thing in the morning, beautifully lit with a calm reflection, took 30 days of cycling there and back. So yeah, some of these photos don't come without a certain amount of commitment. But I do love birds, and I still love birds, and I still walk around the island here where we live now, pointing my camera at things I think are cool and going out birding. So I haven't changed that much in, God, what is it now, 40 years. I think being able to immerse yourself in the beauty of something in such intricate detail, the way the light is refracting off the surface of this. This is off Vancouver Island in Canada. This is a little redneck phalarope migrating south to bob around in the ocean off Peru. And super confiding. They're just so tame that you can just get so close to these things. But photography allows us to see the world as we can't see it with our eyes. And I think that's one of the superpowers that we should really appreciate. One of my favorite expressions, and I guess this is the start of the talk proper, is that success is not the result of spontaneous combustion. You must set yourself on fire. And I'm a huge advocate of setting ourselves on fire, to ignite the passion, because a life without passion, is it really a life at all? I want to get the most out of my life. I want to look back on the book that I've written in my final days and think, yep, well, that was a good read, and I'm pretty proud of all the things that I've done. So ignition point starts here. Photography for me is most definitely, it ticks an awful lot of boxes. I like to explore. I like to find new things. I don't necessarily get a lot of excitement of seeing a photograph of a certain location at a certain time of day under certain conditions and think, oh, I want that photograph. I don't get a lot of pleasure of going and standing and putting my tripod in somebody else's tripod holes. I would much rather find something myself. I think surprise is another superpower of creative photography. When you can surprise yourself, then you're winning. That to me is a huge component. This photograph was taken in Cornwall, down on the southwest of England. Just when I moved back to the UK in 2013, I actually lived there for a short while. I was writing a book on seascape photography, and Cornwall was beautiful. And I found this little cove, and this photo was taken right next to a really famous composition that loads of other people had taken before. And I just went somewhere that nobody else had gone and found these. So yeah, I do get super excited. Like I mentioned earlier, I did live in Tibet and lived in Lhasa on and off for about 7 years. I was in Lhasa for a couple of years and really immersed myself in the Tibetan culture. We spent a lot of time in monasteries, had a lot of friends who were either lamas or monks. And even though I'm not a Buddhist, that stuff really rubs off on you. That kind of attitude to yourself and the way you grow and the point of life really kind of rubbed off on me. And it's so surreal cycling around a modern city and you turn the corner and then there's the Potala Palace, and it's just ridiculously incongruous. But every image is a memory. Watching the full moon setting behind the Potala, all of these things, it just takes me right back. I always loved the little light that was on in that window down on the right-hand side there. This was at like 3 a.m. or something. And I just thought, oh, well, someone's contemplating life and their place in the universe and thinking about enlightenment. So I always really liked this one. In 2014, I co-led an expedition into the Himalaya with Mark Adamus, who I'm sure many of you will know, probably the world's most dynamic and impressive landscape photographer. Mark and I have been really good friends for well over 10 years now, and this was taken from about 5,500 meters, so this is pretty high up. The peak that's lit on the right-hand side there's Everest, and the one that's peeking from behind the ridge on the left is Makalu. So this is a couple of the 8,000 meter peaks. And I get a lot of comments on this photograph saying, oh, what a really cool low perspective, and how everything kind of jigsaw pieces itself into kind of quite a harmonious composition. And the truth of it is that I'd hiked up to this little alpine lake in the early hours of the morning before sunrise, and collapsed in a kind of hypoxic state, and literally where I fell over and was just lying there. I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. And I literally set up my camera where I was lying and took a shot. So yeah, a bit of serendipity. But something to remember is that every photograph doesn't exist until you point your camera at it. People kind of diminish the importance of landscape photography, and they kind of imply that it's the world is just waiting there, perfect for you to point your camera at it, and it's not really creative or it's not really difficult. Anyone who's ever tried landscape photography knows it's not easy, but this photograph literally did not exist until I decided to point my camera at it. This is Everest on the left there, and the way the light is kind of shining up behind that peak on the right-hand side, creating these really incongruous shadows. And whether anybody else likes it or not, I frankly don't care. To me, it's a memory and it's aesthetically kind of interesting. But yeah, our diary of engagement is something that I think is really important. Every photograph is part of our diary of engagement. I'm going to come back to this photograph a little bit later. This was from the same expedition that I did with Mark. It's probably my most Adamus-like photograph. And we will definitely come back to this. But the most important question I think one should ask oneself, and I would encourage you to ask, is why do you make photographs? Why do we make photographs? If you start with that question, it's much better than walking through life blind, just pointing your camera at things. I think understanding why you actually need to make photographs is a really, really important question to ask. The actual camera we use is somewhat irrelevant. I make photographs with my Hasselblad, my 501cm, which is a 6x6 medium format film camera. And this slide is a little out of date. The GFX 100S is now a GFX 100 Mark II. My wife is now the owner of that 100S. But the actual tool we use, and I refer you back to the point I made earlier, which is the camera is just a conduit for us. It's a way for us to express ourselves. Cameras are not expressive on their own, in the same way that the guitars behind me are not expressive on their own. You put a guitar in the hands of someone who doesn't know how to play, and it doesn't matter how expensive the guitar is. And likewise with a camera. One of my favorite old expressions, I used to talk to Guy Tal quite a lot. And I remember having a conversation with him once, and he said, yeah, if you go into a camera store and buy a fancy camera, you call yourself a photographer. Whereas if you go into a music store and buy a flute, you own a flute. And I think we should remember that, is that we are not as good as our gear. We should be better than our gear up here. So one of the first reasons I started making photographs was escape. I've written and talked extensively about my mental health over the years. I am not the person today that I was perhaps 6 or 7 years ago, and I'll talk more about that later. I did suffer horribly from anxiety and panic attacks and depression for quite large chunks of my life, probably 30 years. And I used to go into the landscape or point my camera at bird life to escape. This is a long-billed dowitcher in Palo Alto Baylands in California. I spent a winter there one year, more or less just photographing birds. This little cool thing they do with their beaks is called rhinokinensis. And it basically allows them to grab worms in the mud without having to open the whole beak, which you would obviously get full of mud. So it's a really cool thing. So I really love this shot. It's a really cool one. It's yeah. It's funny when these slides come up. It's some of the photos I haven't seen for a while, and it's like, yeah, I kind of like that one. I do have other means of escape. I've been playing guitar since I was 14, and the photo on the left is for when God gives me 10 hands. But I escape by playing guitar. I escape by making photographs. Creativity is a word that's bandied around a whole lot. I think a lot of photographers start with photography or try to use their photography to be creative. And the word creativity, I think, is misunderstood when it comes to photography. When I start with an empty, silent room and I play a note on a guitar, that in itself isn't music until I play another note. And then you have a relationship between one note and another note, or one chord and another chord, and you're composing. And if you're making things up as you go along, surprising yourself, then you have more chance to create. You can't create by copying. And this is something that I've worked really hard over the years to try and do. This photograph was also taken in the rice terraces of southern China. The first time I went, I think it must have been 2004. So 20 years ago, I made this photograph. And I was always really interested in relationships, relationships between shapes and forms and parts of the frame and how our eyes wander around it. So that was something that always kind of interested me. And creativity is not something you can learn. You can learn all sorts of things to do with photography. Creativity is not one of them. I think you can be creative in any genre of photography. It doesn't have to be landscapes or streets or portraiture. You can be creative in any way you like. This photograph was taken under a blue sky in Shetland, the Shetland Isles. 3 years ago, I think I took this one. And this is a pretty morose, melancholic puffin. It looks kind of sad, but it looks kind of contemplative too. It's almost thinking it's to fish or not to fish. That is the question. One of the things I think is super important in terms of making photographs is experiences. And this photograph here was taken back in the fall of 2003, I think it was. It was one of the first landscape shots I ever took, actually. Up until that point, I was very much a bird photographer. And I was on vacation in Canada. I had a buddy who lived in Banff, and we were staying with him. And I'd actually bought my first landscape lens that morning down in Calgary. I'd bought a Canon 17-40. And I'd gone to this location at sunset, or late afternoon and into sunset. And there was about 50 other photographers there, all playing musical chairs or musical tripods with each other. And as soon as one person moved, somebody else would go and stand in exactly the same place, and everyone was just taking exactly the same shots. And this photograph was taken at midnight. And I'd gone back to my buddies. We'd had a really great dinner. We'd drunk a bunch of wine. And we were just going to bed, and I saw the light. There was a full moon shining right across the valley. And I thought, I wonder what would happen if. So we jumped in the car, ignore the drunk part there. This is a long time ago. And we went down to the or rather I drove down to the lake on my own, pardon me, and stood in the same places that I'd stood maybe 4 or 5 hours earlier, but there was nobody there. And I had this incredible experience just down at the edge of this lake on my own in the middle of the night, trying to work out how to make photographs in the dark, and found out it wasn't easy. But I made images that surprised me, and I got really excited about it. I'd actually studied astronomy and astrophysics at university, so I've always had this kind of passion for the night and the light, the incongruous light that you get at that time of day. And it started me on a journey for the next 8 years until I published my first ebook, How to Photograph the Landscape at Night. And I produced this book called Seeing the Unseen, because that's really what you're doing at night, is you're photographing things you can't see. And that was the start of my professional photographic career. 2012, published my first ebook, and I haven't looked back since. I'm very fortunate to run a successful business, to make all of our income as landscape photographers, to live this lifestyle, to hopefully inspire and motivate other people to shed the shackles of conventional boundaries with their photography. And at the end of the day, going to places, this is actually in Iceland, in midsummer. So that's midnight, I think, again, in the middle of summer in the Icelandic highlands. And, you get to go to these cool places and have these amazing experiences. And why wouldn't you do that? So we do get wrapped up horribly with our photography, and we worry about things, and we worry about getting judged and whether people are going to like it. But I think if we go there with an open heart and an open mind, we can produce things that we love. And if you do that first, then everything else, I think, tends to follow afterwards. I've always had a strong imagination. My mind just works like that. And for me, releasing my imagination through my photography is a really cool thing to do. This was literally the first landscape photo I ever took. Literally, this is image number 1 in my Lightroom catalog for landscapes, taken on Vancouver Island, in somewhere I go quite frequently now. I hang out with Adam Gibbs here. And just the way this image framed itself, it just reminded me of fairies and, again, very Lord of the Rings-like and things like that. And I still love this image. Maybe I wouldn't process it like this today, but, I still really like the kind of recession and the kind of framing within frames. This type of thing is a lot more recent. This was taken last year in Spain. I run a lot of workshops in Spain. I lived there for a year. And I just point my camera at things I think are cool. It's just rocks and sand. It's not earth-shattering in any way, but if I think something is aesthetically appealing, then that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to point my camera at it. Instead of photographing a sunrise, I'll photograph the reflection of a sunrise. And that, for me, is a way to create more intimate images, to make more incongruous images. And this is very typical of my type of photography, I think, is that kind of more intimate, less explicit, landscapey type thing. However, popularity is a very important part, particularly if you're going to run a business. And when I went to Canada for numerous times, this is back in 2014, I made this photograph one morning. This is Mount Assiniboine in the Canadian Rockies, one of the most beautiful areas I've ever been. Hanging out with Adam Gibbs this morning again. And, this photograph back in 2014 was super popular. It was back in the days of 500px. It was all about likes and popularity and, people following your work, and you make a name for yourself based upon how popular your work is. And it's just a sad reflection of contemporary society that we have to evaluate everything in a competitive manner. But if you're trying to build a business, then you have to be popular. It doesn't matter how good a photographer I am, or how deep and meaningful I am, or how profound I am when I write. If people don't like my work, it doesn't really matter. So popularity is one of the curses of trying to be a professional. I made a black and white version of this, which I much prefer. But I didn't have the confidence back in 2014 to make this version. I actually did this in 2018 when I was releasing my Luminosity and Contrast ebook. I did a black and white version, which far, far closer represented how I felt about that scene and what I wanted to convey. So the lesson there is stick to your guns, do what you think is right for you. And if people don't like it, that's unfortunately true. But, I think self-actualization is probably more important. Of course, I've been to some beautiful landscapes all over the world. I mean, I do get to travel a lot, and I do get to go to some cool places. This is in Huangshan, Yellow Mountains of Eastern China. I've been fortunate to go there 6, 7, 8 times. I've run workshops there over the years. And, you get to see these incredible scenes. And what we're going to do shortly is look at the language of photography and look at how we express ourselves and look at the implications of all the different things within photography and how they help us to articulate. I did say we're going to come back to this photograph because this is a photograph that had one purpose, which was for me to be popular. This is, again, at the height of 500px, taken in 2014, published in 2014. And at the time, I was trying to get a name for myself, I guess, as a big landscape photographer. And I'm going to show you now the raw file, which is this. And I wish I could hear the gasp. This is what I actually captured. It's a handheld pano at 14 mil. So vertical orientation, handheld at like half a second or something. So I'm fairly impressed with that. But this and this are no, this is lying, and unfortunately, this is where photography went, where producing things that were just incredibly impressive was more important than being authentic and genuine. And obviously now with the advent of AI and all of the skullduggery that goes on, I mean, this has a sky replaced. I think the sky's from Iceland. So I'm not proud of this. I actually call this my zenith of shame. It's the absolute pinnacle of how badly I felt about myself and my photography. But at the end of the day, it was a catalyst for me to go one of two ways. I could either quit or I could change. And I decided to change. And when you start looking at all of these reasons for making photographs, acceptance, validation, ego, reputation, money, because we're all millionaires, of course, you start looking at it and you think, well, why am I making photographs? And if I'm not authentic to myself in the answer to that question, then I'm in the wrong game. So I don't intend to tell you why you should make photographs. That's not my job. My job is not to tell you why to make photographs, but I can share with you why I do. And I have spent the last 25 years of my life digging really deep into why I make photographs, why I point my camera at some things and not other things, and when I know I'm being authentic, when I know I'm being genuine. So things like this, I'm a firm believer that there's no bad light. There are, you can make photographs on, this is pouring with rain. I mean, this is the Isle of Skye in Scotland. I was running a workshop. You take clients to a place like this when it's pouring with rain and mist is just rolling around and you can't see the dramatic view. You have to be able to show them that there are opportunities there. And this is what I aim to do on workshops, is to show that there is no such thing as bad light. There are just different opportunities. You can make photographs on what you would call bad weather days that you can't make on optimal good weather days. By the end of 2016, my mental health was terrible. I was deeply unhappy. I was incredibly miserable. I used to lie awake most of the night sweating in a panic. And I'd wake up before dawn and I would usually head out into the mountains to just exhaust myself. I would go on these huge ultra runs through the mountains on my own. I would push myself physically to exhaustion just so I could get a few hours sleep when I got home. I mean, it was just a wretched, wretched time of my life. And I hated my own photography. And in January of 2017, I went into the Gobi Desert for the first time. And it changed my life more than in any way I could have even imagined. At that time, I was very much a wide-angle photographer. The photos I was just showing with big, wide, expansive landscapes and wide-angled lenses and stuff. And I went into the Gobi and it just didn't work. That type of approach just didn't work in that type of landscape. You're alone, you're 100, 200 kilometers from the nearest road. It was minus 26 Celsius, camping out. It was a pretty brutal environment to be in. And I'm going to read you, I actually wrote a book about it. which is behind me, Out of Darkness. So I'm just going to read a few short passages from that because it says it better than I could say it today. At first, I couldn't photographically rationalize what I was seeing. It was just too big, too empty, and lacked a subject. There was no familiar template of foreground, midground, background for me to hang on to. My repetitious approach to aesthetics was challenged and then crushed. I felt scared, panicked, and impotent, while at the time infused with a sense of beauty, simplicity, and peace. So that infusion of the feeling of the landscape was really important to me, to realize that the landscape had an agenda that I couldn't see. And it was up to me to find a way to understand the landscape without me trying to superimpose my template-like beliefs of what photographs should be. So to carry on, I actually surrendered. I recall the moment when I just accepted the landscape for what it was. Every problem, barrier, and preconception had been brought there by myself. I'd packed my panic-stricken mind in my camera bag with my filters and lenses. We shoulder our burden and then feel aggravated that the world is as we expect it to be, fraught with obstacles and unfulfillment. If you go into a landscape with expectations and the landscape has different ideas, you will be disappointed. If you go into a landscape in a negative mindset because it doesn't live up to what you want, or you feel bad about who you are at that time, you're going to make poor photographs, but when you just surrender to the landscape in a given moment and allow it to guide you, it's quite a profound change. This is one of my favorite photographs of all time. I absolutely love this photograph. So yeah, I'm sitting here thinking, yeah. Sorry, I'm gonna go into 20 minutes of self-love. For those precious days, I decided to let my intuition drive. If something caught my eye, I resisted the desire to analyze. I accepted my interest, raised my camera, and pressed the shutter. Each repetition was a bicep curl for my creativity, my self-expression. I lived in a flow state characterized by unthinking mindlessness and intuitive aesthetics. I never questioned why, never rationalized how the frames fit within societal norms or external expectations. I just lived in the moment and pressed the shutter every time I thought, hey, that's cool. You'll notice there's a word in there, mindlessness. This is my version of mindfulness. This is my empty mind state. This is me not thinking at all. Mindfulness is knowing that you're thinking, or noticing that you're thinking, and somehow detaching your emotion from it. Mindlessness, you don't even have thoughts. You just surrender. And it was a cool thing. And what I discovered was that I would point my cameras at things that I probably wouldn't have done had I been looking for photographs. I obviously have a large collection of photographs from the Gobi Desert. I went there 7 times over a 3 to 4 year period. Spent many, many, many days camping out in the desert. And every time I went, I would surrender. And I haven't known any better way of just disappearing than going somewhere incredibly remote. But I did produce a body of work that I'm really, really proud of. And it changed not just my photography, but changed my life. I had no idea if the images were any good. I just carried on engaging and exploring. For the first time, I experienced the therapeutic nature of switching off my consciousness, allowing someone else to drive for a while, sitting back and enjoying the view without the baggage of the never-ending internal monologue. I'm sure many of you suffer from an internal monologue. The best description I ever heard of your inner voice was a guy called Dan Harris, who wrote, he said, if you sat on an airplane next to your inner monologue, you would punch their lights out. If someone sat next to you on an aircraft and talked to you the way that you talk to yourself inside your own head, you would want to kill them. And we're stuck with them. This idiot co-pilot that's in my head all the time, you have to change that. And that, for me, was, I understood then there was a relationship between my photography and this inner landscape, I suppose. And I started having games with myself. I mean, this photograph here is a really good example. This is me trying to see how little I could make a photograph with. You know, this is a pretty minimalistic scene. I continue to surrender, to accept my innate aesthetic resonances and just press the shutter when the landscape whispered yes. I think whispering landscapes are far more impressive than shouting landscapes. I think anybody can go to Meraki boulders at sunset and photograph something, or sunrise, photograph beautiful light with these incredible incongruous boulders, and make a photograph that's impressive. But to go to Meraki boulders and take something that nobody else has thought of or seen, you have to listen to the whispers, not the shouting. I came up with the term, the emotional spectrum, and I realized that photographically, I was actually portraying a very wide range of emotions. So the photograph on the left and the photograph on the right are very different, but they're both sand. They were both taken in the Gobi. They were both taken, you know, because I wanted to take them. They were things that I noticed in the landscape. But the one on the left feels very different from the one on the right. And this was an exciting discovery, which was pretty much set the course for my work ever since, and hopefully into the future. Because once we realize that we can express how we feel through our photographs, and that our photographs can express something more than I was in the desert and I thought this was cool, then, you know, we realize that the importance of the depth that we have at our disposal with our photography. Making pretty pictures isn't difficult. Making meaningful photographs is harder. So what makes us point our camera at one thing and ignore something else? Why is our unique perspective so important? I'm gonna have a mouthful of coffee. So in the early part of 2018, I came up with the 5 triggers of engagement. Some of you who watch our YouTube or may have read some of our ebooks will know of this, but I think it's worth covering here because I think it's pretty important. So the 5 triggers of engagement, these are the 5 things that I identified once I started studying my photographs. It was, well, why did I point my camera at that? And I think that degree of analysis, which happened both while I was looking at my photographs that I'd taken, and likewise if I was out in the landscape without a camera, you know, just out in the landscape, and it's like, well, why do I notice that? So I came up with 5 things. Luminosity. Luminosity is just a fancy term for light. I just think it sounds more romantic. I just like the word luminosity, which is why I used it. So light is energy. If you doubt that, ask a plant. All plants know the power of light. Light is life, yeah? So when we look at a scene like this, it's the light and the distribution of light that is always going to be a really important trigger for us. Photography is light. You can't photograph in pitch darkness. You need light. So obviously it's such an important trigger, but it doesn't live on its own. It may seem obvious, but we are drawn to light like moths to a flame. Wherever you have light in an image or light in a landscape, you will look at it. This was the first time I went to Iceland back in 2011, the first time I went to this particular beach, in fact, and this is probably the first photograph I took when I got there. And this is the moon. The moon is rising in the distance there. And the light on the water and the light in the sky and the way the light filters through the little iceberg there, that creates a very powerful roadmap of where we are going to look in this frame. But light can't exist on its own. Light has to be contrast. There has to be something to contrast light with. And the obvious one here is darkness. If you have contrast, you have a difference between darkness and light. And it is the darkness of the frame here that allows the light to be the star of the show, whether it's the leaves on the birch trees there or the little god beam drifting down into the bottom left-hand corner there. That contrast is, if I'd opened the shadows in this scene, you would have less contrast. If I'd made the lights not as bright, we would have less contrast. So contrast is a really, really important trigger for us. And if I look at the next frame here, this is a very low contrast scene. Yeah, so this is a misty day, super foggy. You can barely make out the trees there. It's a very, very minimalistic scene, very, very low contrast. And I recognize that contrast is directly proportional to impact. High contrast images have more impact, low contrast images have less impact. But I also identified there was all sorts of different types of contrast. There's the obvious one, tonal contrast, the differences between the lights and the darks. But there's also texture. You can have areas of detail to those of areas without detail. And color is a very important type of contrast. And this is one of the things I would urge you to do, is push the boundaries of your definitions. We dive into Lightroom every day and there's a contrast slider. How many of you have ever thought, what is contrast? What is my idea of contrast? What is the consequence of me moving this slider? How does this image change when I affect contrast? And these are things that I've done for decades, and it's really just partly because I teach, and secondly because I'm inquisitive. If we look at the same photograph that we had before as a color image, it feels completely different because we've introduced color contrast. We have cooler tones in the background, we have warmer tones in the foreground. So we have that yellow to blue contrast, which instantly gives us a time of year. So we know that this is now autumn because we've got the yellow leaves on the trees. And the feel of the image is entirely different from the black and white version. If you compare one side by side, the black and white and the color image. Now, if you really want to annoy me, ask me to choose. I can't choose between two photographs because they're not the same. It's like trying to pick your favorite kid. They're different. They have their different attributes. They have their different strengths. The one on the right feels totally different from the one on the left. Lightroom is the gateway to dreams. It's the gateway to infinite possibility. There is no such thing as the definitive version of a photograph. For some purposes, the one on the left will serve me better. For other purposes, the one on the right will serve me better. It depends what I'm trying to articulate, and it depends what I'm trying to say. I use metaphors a huge amount in my work. I follow lots of guitar players. Like I said, I've been a really keen guitar player for many, many years. And I get more inspiration from listening to guitar players talking about creativity or explaining their relationship with tone, or a different scale or a different key. So when I start using definitions like this, which is highlights equal energy and shadows equal structure, I'm using a different analogy to change my relationship with the language. Photographic language is boring. Who cares about depth of field or aperture? I don't care. But I tend to think of, like in a musical analogy. So the shadows are the beat, they're the bass, whereas the highlights are the melody. The highlights get stuck in your head. The highlights of an image are going to stick in your head like a melody will become an earworm. So it's important for us to change our relationship with some of these terms. Color is an incredibly important and powerful trigger. While luminosity and contrast may be particularly photographic terms, color is a basic function of our perception. The most famous album cover of all time, probably, Dark Side of the Moon, tells us that light is made up of different colors. And the lexicon of emotion is intrinsically and totally linked to our emotions. We know what it feels like to feel blue or to see red. We understand there is an emotional relationship between color and how we feel. So an image like this, for example, the color palette is really important. It's a mossy forest. This is actually on the island of Tenerife in the Atlantic. Been there quite a few times, running workshops. Beautiful, beautiful island. And when you get fog up in this laurel forest, it's a really atmospheric place. So the way that contrast and luminosity and color are working together here to create quite a moody photograph. You wouldn't call this happy, yeah? And I would urge you, when you look at your photographs, to start using emotional language. Something like this is a very, very simple photograph, using shallow depth of field to focus through twigs that are caught water on them through to something else in the background. And it creates this very atmospheric, somewhat surreal scene. And the color palette used is very expressive. This is not a photograph that you would consider happy. I made this in 2018, a very unhappy time of my life. I was just getting divorced, breaking free from a relationship that had caused me an awful lot of trauma over the years. And I made a series of images called Music from Dark Spaces, creating that connection between my musical preferences, my aesthetic preferences, and my emotional preferences. And this went on to become a series of images that I really, really loved. But when you take something like this, it feels so incredibly different. So why does this feel different? Well, we could talk about subject matter. We could talk about the differences between sand and forests. But that is just an attribute. That's just a word. You know, I don't tend to look on my photographs as photographs of things. I look on my photographs as autobiographical. This is somehow reflecting something that's going on inside of me. So this is obviously a much more warm tones. It's much more dynamic. It's much more soothing in a way. But equally, that those deep, deep shadows are areas that you could lose yourself in. So when we look at a range of photographs, if we look on those three photographs again, they all express something different, but they're all me. And this is where it's really important not to get hung up on the concept of a photographic style or a personal style. Are these photographs similar in a way? You know, are they recognizably Alister Benn photographs? I don't know. I don't have that perspective. Everything I make earnestly and honestly is just a reflection of my inner landscape, and therefore it feels very genuine to me. And I like to have all of these different facets. I don't want to be one-dimensional. I don't want to have a predictable personality. I wrote recently that human beings are like diamonds. You need every facet to sparkle. You need to have every facet of your personality to allow the whole thing to shine. So as photographers, I very much believe we're in the storytelling business, and those stories for me are emotional. So I want to tell emotional stories because that's what art is. It's a way for us to express our perspectives and our perceptions and to share them with other people who may not have our ability to articulate some of these things. So it should be clear from the next slide that images are usually constructed of combinations of triggers: luminosity, contrast, color. So these, again, they're all sand, they're all taken from the Gobi, they all feel very, very differently. They have different hues, they have different amounts of contrast. But the one thing that's also incredibly different in these is the fourth trigger, which is geometry. I believe that geometry is the most underrated term in landscape photography. If we think about what composition is geometry. We're subdividing the frame using lines and curves and patterns and textures and contrast and luminosity and color. We are arranging a frame in a way that makes it feel a certain way. So you would say that this image is pretty calm. We have soothing lines, we have low contrast, we have very sensual curves. It's a very gentle image. The saturation isn't too high. It's quite subtle and quite subdued. It's a kind of intoxicating, hypnotic image. You could lose yourself. And when I'm looking at the screen, I'm no doubt getting a better version of this photograph than you will on a projector in your hall there. I can see all of the nuance and all of the detail. But if I look at this next image, what's changed? Well, the saturation is higher, the colors are deeper and more rich, the contrast is much higher. We also have more angularity, the kind of dynamic Harry Potter-like lightning bolt up in the top of the frame there. The dynamics of this image are completely different. And remember when I said contrast is proportional to impact. Contrast is another form of geometry, geometric contrast. So if we look at a photograph like this, again, taken on the north coast of Spain, this was the cover of my night photography book, one of my more famous photographs, I suppose. I still really like it. It's a real favorite of mine. Why are we drawn to scenes like this? Well, jagged, pointy things in a simple composition. You point your camera at something pointy and people will like it. It's a Pavlovian reaction for viewers, is that if you show them something pointy, they're going to go, wow. And it's because it's geometrically dynamic. There are very few eye-popping photographs taken in Kansas, flat landscapes, unless there are huge thunderheads rising up out of the prairies, creating the dynamics. There's a very famous American landscape photographer, a guy called Clyde Butcher. He was born up in Colorado and he moved to the Florida Everglades and opened a studio down there. And incredible black and white photographer. If you haven't checked out his work, please do so. He is an absolute master of his genre. But when he went to Florida, they said, well, don't you miss the mountains? And he said, the clouds are my mountains. And again, looking out to sea off the east coast of New Zealand, when the storms are rolling in, they are your mountains. You don't have to go across to the west coast. Photographs like this are just examples of pointiness. Most of these are older photographs. You're not going to see too many photographs from me today that look like this. Again, this is from Iceland, I think from 2011. Yeah, you know, I like it. It's certainly dynamic and very pointy. This is from the Isle of Skye, another pointy mountain, taken at sunrise in August with the heather coming into bloom. You know, photographs like this, I think most photographers are going to say, yeah, you know, this is a good photograph, or they're going to think it's overcooked, or they might start questioning how real it is in comparison to what was seen. But these are all conversations that I think are irrelevant at the end of the day. We have to make photographs for ourselves. So composition could be described as the arrangement of geometry. But equally, you know, we're subdividing the frame, space, lines, and form. Composition is my favorite topic, and it's something that's very, very hard to teach. I am not a rules-based photographer. I don't believe in teaching composition by teaching rules, purely because it, well, we won't get into that discussion. I did a YouTube video on it a couple of weeks ago, if anyone's interested. But yeah, for me, composition is about feel. The fifth and final trigger is atmosphere. And I would challenge any photographer to drive along a road and turn a corner and see a forest like this covered in fog and not be slamming on the brakes to try and find a pull off to stop the car, to dive out with their cameras. Atmosphere is one of the most photogenic and powerful things that we ever see. It's what we dream about as landscape photographers. Without the fog in this scene, it's a pretty forest, but it's not going to have the same emotional impact as this. Mystery is one of the most powerful tools we have at our disposal. And fog and atmosphere are the best way of showing mystery. There are other ways, but fog is probably one of the better ways. This again was taken in the Yellow Mountains of Huangshan on the east of China. And whenever you go there, you dream of fog. It's bad to have expectations, and it's bad to hope that the weather is going to deliver what you wish for. But when you're running a workshop there and you've got a few people who are desperate for fog, then, you know, we're all praying, put it that way. So as soon as you introduce fog, you're introducing this sense of mystery. And it's also a really great way to increase the sense of depth in a photograph. This was taken also in southern China. This is down in an area called Yangzhou. And you climb up these limestone karsts in the dark in the morning, hoping you're climbing up through the fog, and you hope before you get to the top that you come out through the fog. And on this particular morning, we did. And it's, that's just an agricultural river valley below us, covered in little villages and stuff. But as soon as the fog is there, it creates this surreal, otherworldly landscape that has very little human evidence in it. You suddenly, you turn into this far more alien type of landscape, which allows our imaginations to start, going crazy. This is in Arctic Finland. An amazing place, the coldest place I've ever photographed, about -36, -37 Celsius, super, super cold. And you snowshoe up onto this kind of plateau, which is covered in all these trees that get covered in this kind of rime, this sort of rime frost and snow, and create all of these really amazing shapes. Now, the atmosphere in the back, obviously there's fog and it's getting sidelit by the rising sun, so it creates this very mysterious scene. But I'm sure I'm not the only one who sees an old woman in a dress stood there. No drugs are involved in the perception of this photograph. More coffee. So it should become clear that if we start thinking of the 5 triggers, it opens up possibilities to compose images in ways that are less obvious. I think we should point our cameras at the world in a way that excites us and gets us interested and engaged, particularly if we go to locations that have been photographed heavily. This area of Iceland, I've seen a gazillion photographs from. I've never seen one with this composition. And being open to challenge ourselves and to push boundaries, I think, is such an important part. But if you start thinking now about the 5 triggers, okay, we have luminosity, all of the snow is luminous, we have luminosity in the clouds. Contrast, we wouldn't have those patterns without the dark and the light, particularly in that foreground. There's a tiny little bit of color in there. You can see the tops of the grasses in the middle area. Again, it's quite a cool wintry feel. So there's atmosphere in this, there's geometry in this, there's luminosity, contrast, and a little bit of color in this. So all of the attributes come together to create every individual photograph. Photograph is a beautiful marriage of craft and art. You can't think your way into creativity. You can't, you're not going to be able to think your way into becoming a better photographer. You have to surrender to your own intuitive ways. Craft is an important part of photography, understanding the implications of time on your photographs, understanding the implications of focal length and depth of field, and all of those types of things are obviously very, very important. But 95% of photography isn't craft, it's actually art. It's composition, and composition has very little to do with craft. I think composition is the distribution of feel. If you think about how each part of the frame feels and how it relates to every other part of the frame, then you're going to build up a far more intuitive and emotional relationship with your photography. And at the end of the day, whether it's just you that feels that, or it does translate and can be communicated to somebody else, sharing photographs is an important part of photography, whether it's a print or in a book or a photo club competition. We're sharing images. We're saying, this is something I like. And unfortunately, a lot of people criticize photographs by confusing their personal preferences to accurate critique. And I think that's the biggest problem with photography these days, is that if someone doesn't like it, they tell you it's not good, when in actual fact, it might just not be that they understand what you're trying to say with your photography. Music is a great example. I'm not sure how many of you are sat there in that room, but let's say there's 20 people, and each of you had to bring one song to play tonight for the meeting, do you think that you would like all of the music that was played? What are the chances that someone's going to bring a piece of music to play or to listen to that they're the only person in the room that likes it, and everyone else thinks, oh my God, this is awful. This is just a racket. I know too many friends from university who used to listen to early Frank Zappa or Captain Beefheart or acid jazz or all of these mad genres of music, and I couldn't stand it. But it doesn't mean it's bad. And photography is the same. You should be making photographs that resonate with you and say what you want to express. If people don't like them, that's their problem, not yours. As long as you're making sure that care has been taken. This is a really important word in photography, and it's something that's not used a lot. You will notice that I haven't used the word leading line so far. I don't think leading line is a particularly important term in photography, but I think transitions is. And if you think about the types of transitions that you can have dark to light, cool to warm, here to there. Three-dimensionality is a transition. And if we look at this photograph, this was taken in the Sahara, this is in Morocco. This has various transitions. I can't point at the screen on PowerPoint, but the foreground feels very close. It's very sharp, it's very detailed, it's very textured. And as you will see, the darkest shadows are in the foreground. They're not at the back. And what that's allowing the brain to do is to get a strong sense of here. There is something close that's receding to something further away. You will also notice that the dune shadows in the back are slightly cooler than they are in the front. That's another transition. We have cool to warm, we have dark to light, we have here to there. And it's those transitions that allow us to explore a frame, to know where we want to go. Obviously, the beautiful sunrise in the background is a major draw. Everyone is going to get drawn to that eventually, maybe even first in the frame. But at the same time, you're giving the viewer a reason to linger in the foreground. I've always said with foregrounds in photographs that if you're going to put a foreground in a photograph, you better make it worth looking at. You know, there's too many photographs that I see where the foreground has just been stuck there to create some kind of juxtaposition with the background, but they've got no connection. They don't really belong together. It's a photograph that's been made with jigsaw pieces where I need a foreground in this photograph to make it a landscape. I do very much play games with myself, with my photography. I do like to strip things down to see what is the absolute bare minimum I can get away with. These shadows are not clipped, but they're near as damn it. They're probably +2 or something, so they're pretty dark. There's certainly no detail in those shadows. But the silhouette of that cliff with the beautiful rocks and the trees, I think is a very strong dynamic and geometric part of the frame. And the left-hand side of the frame is really made up of 3 or 4 tones. It's your classic recession. So we know that the mountains in the background are further away because they're less dark. And this is the bare minimum, I guess, of three-dimensionality in a photograph. It feels very 2D, but we know that there is depth in this scene. So transitions are the framework of successful images, I believe. I think it's important for images to have transitions. Nature itself has plenty of transitions. You only have to walk outside and look to the distant horizon to realize that there are things that are here and there are things that are over there. And what I would urge all of you is to go out without your cameras, go for a hike, go for a walk through an open landscape where you can see the horizon, and you will very quickly realize that contrast, luminosity, color, texture, detail, atmosphere, geometry, of course, are all there just waiting for you to notice them. And I think that is a really nice way to explore a new world, is to sit back passively, don't get your camera out of the bag too soon, Don't rush to make photographs. Don't grab your tripod and extend it to its maximum height so you're taking every photograph from eye level. Slow down, take your time, allow the landscape to talk to you. So the emotional landscape, which is my approach to photography, is made up of luminosity, contrast, color, atmosphere, geometry, and transitions. A lot of my photographs are taken with long lenses, either an 80 to 400, or now I'm shooting with the GFX, the 100 to 200. I do take quite a lot of zoomed in landscapes just because I like isolating bits of landscapes. I'm not sure how well this one will be showing on your screen, but there's only 4 tones in this photograph. There's the black cliff with the incongruous hole with the boulder stuck in it. And then there are 2 tones on the right to show 2 layers of mountains, and then there's the sky. So there are literally only 4 tones in this scene. I really like this photograph. It makes me smile because it's so minimal. If I had any detail in those left-hand rocks at all, they would be asking to be looked at. And I think that's another really important thing, is that you can't stick a Post-it note over part of a frame and say, don't look here. All you can do is give people less reason to look there. And that, I think, is part of the craft of photography, is understanding that everything that's contained within an image is there to be seen. And the only way that you can make people not want to look at it is to make it harder for them to discern any detail. So in this particular scene, again, very atmospheric. The left-hand cliff gets darker the further up we go. And that's basically saying, don't look at the top left. It's a way of, that's a Post-it note, is don't look there. I want the connection between the tree on the left-hand cliff and the kind of cool rocks on the right-hand, more atmospheric section. I want that to be the story. I want the left-hand cliff and the far right. I don't want that top left. We can make photographs in any way we choose. We can free ourselves from any conventional standards. A lot of the photographs in my book, Out of Darkness, are pretty unconventional. They're not what you would consider to be normal, but neither do I consider myself in any way to be normal. You know, I'd like to be different. I like to be myself. I like to be free to express myself. But every photograph you look at from now on, you will realize the role of luminosity, of contrast, of color, of geometry, of atmosphere. And sometimes you will have a photograph that doesn't have one of those attributes in it. Black and white photography, of course, doesn't have color, but that makes the tones and the contrast in black and white even more important. So we are doing things for a reason. Creativity is the pursuit and the expression of art through these attributes. I'm a massive fan of intuition. I think it's probably the most underused skills by most photographers. I think most photographers tend to go into landscapes either with a preconceived idea of what they want to achieve because they've seen other photographs from that place that they either want to emulate or to get their own versions of. They have expectations of what weather conditions may be required for them to make that type of photograph. And unfortunately, the landscape doesn't care. The landscape doesn't care what we want. And I think it's a far more useful skill to be able to go into a landscape and be surprised, to listen, to see, to notice, to find something that somehow reflects who you are in that time. Like I said earlier on, my mental health was dreadful up until about 6 years ago. And now I'm a different person. You know, I don't have anxiety. I don't have panic attacks. I'm not depressed. I've used my creativity to explore my relationship with a lot of these sensations and emotions and negative feelings to produce work that is a reflection of that, an externalization of that. So my advice, I think, is to learn to feel rather than see. We talk about creative seeing. We talk about composition as creative seeing. for me, composition is far more about feel. How does that make you feel? Does it energize you? Does it make you feel calm? Does it make you feel sad? Does it make you feel happy? Does it make you feel like you want to shout from the top of a mountaintop? All of these different feelings is really what we're into. Listen to your passion. And if you don't have passion, ask yourself why. I know a lot of photographers who have nearly quit because they didn't have passion anymore. And I think a very large proportion of those was they felt that the images they wanted to make weren't what people wanted to like. And I think that can be a huge barrier. And I always try and urge, I don't know much about Christchurch Photographic Society, and I'm sure you're a great bunch of people. And I think the best thing that camera photographic societies can do is to encourage individuality and to celebrate individuality. Don't seek your creativity. I think the words creativity and enlightenment are synonyms. No one ever got enlightened by seeking it. People get enlightened when they realize they were already enlightened. And I think creativity is the same. You will never intellectualize your way into creativity. Anything you can imagine is not creativity. Creativity is the stuff that you surprise yourself with. And I would always urge people to look in, not out. You will find your inspiration and your motivation and your passion inside. If I can be a catalyst to you doing that, then that's a good thing. But you can never motivate somebody. You can bully and threaten people to achieve, but I don't think that's what motivation really means. I think to motivate is, like I said at the beginning of this talk, which is motivation is you need to set yourself on fire. So that will come from within. And what you will find is that passion will drive you further. And really, I just think there's a world out there that's waiting for your jigsaw-shaped piece. I think all of us are unique for a reason. A society needs diversity. A society needs differences for it to be functional. We should celebrate each other's creative differences because that's a way for us to understand the depth and breadth of society. I think one thing that New Zealand does really, really well is to celebrate that diversity, far more so than some other countries I could name. So, I think you guys should be super, super proud of the way that your society embraces that generally. And artistically and creatively, the world is just waiting for your jigsaw piece to slip into an empty slot, because that's what your images are. They fill a void that only you can fill. We're nearing the end. I would urge anyone who hasn't invested in my 3 ebooks. These are the expressive photography ebooks, Luminosity and Contrast, The Color of Meaning, and Creativity Superpowers. That is a bad title. Expressive.photography/education. We're not a www. And we're not a .com. So expressive.photography/education will take you to our store. Of course, I do have my book, Out of Darkness, but unfortunately shipping them all the way across the world is expensive. So yeah, I'm not going to try and sell any books. But yeah, the ebooks, of course, are much more affordable, and they cover some of what I've talked tonight, but in much, much greater detail. So I would urge anyone there to check out those ebooks. I'm still very, very proud of them. I'm totally open to questions, and I'm happy to turn off the presentation now and take any questions that any of you may have. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed what I've had to say.
I'm not sure if you can hear that, Alister, but it must be really tricky sitting there in your office talking to your computer to us on the other side of the world. So yeah, you did really well. That was absorbing. And I'm pleased that you're going to ask for some questions because I'm going to kick it off. I want to talk a little bit about maintaining passion. I don't know about you, but I sort of ebb and flow quite a lot as you go through periods where things go really, really well, and that mindlessness that you were talking about sometimes just happens easily as. Other times it's less so. I wondered how that changed for you when photography became a job. When you're running workshops, like imagine when you're doing the fog dance, or you're looking after somebody who's broken their charger or whatever, the administrative side of things must be less passion inducing. And the same thing making YouTube clips, there must be a logistical side of that that's just hard. Where do you keep the passion alive in that environment?
Thank you. Well, that's a really great question. Thank you. The one thing you're going to realize with me, and the reason I've left quite a lot of time for questions, is if you ask a simple question, you're going to get a long answer. Because I think every question deserves a considered and complete answer. Yes, ebbs and flows are natural for people. You know, look at any sportsman. You know, look at the All Blacks rugby team. You know, the quality they have on the field, they should win every time they play. And it's not because they're suddenly terrible that they lose. It's just because the opposition brought something else on the day that was more than they had to offer. And I think photography is the same, in that one of the worst things we can do for ourselves is to create an expectation of performance. We get to the point where we just think, yeah, I can do this. You know, I'm a professional. I can go out into the landscape and I can make photographs. But that is not the same as passion. That's just repetition. It's muscle memory. And when I turned pro, there was definitely a change where every photograph you make suddenly seems like it has to have a degree of utility. It has to have a purpose. It has to be something to illustrate an ebook or to make a YouTube video for. And I do confess, I don't get to go out with my camera on my own very often just to go and make photographs. This is one of the reasons why I play guitar, is that, you know, if I have a spare hour, I'm more likely to pick up a guitar to play than I am to go out into the landscape and make photographs. I think the other thing we struggle with is that we love definitions. Photographers absolutely love definitions. We love to label. We love to create little subsets within the genre of photography. You know, we call ourselves landscape photographers, or nature photographers, or macro photographers, or street photographers, or fine art black and white photographers. Everyone has this need to create a label. And one of the things that's helped me an awful lot is I tend not to label myself as a photographer as much as I used to. Certainly not to myself. I mean, obviously you have to market yourself as a landscape photographer, but I think that what I try to propagate in myself is creative living. If you can embrace the opportunity to go out every day and notice and be surprised and to think and to create connections, it's so much more satisfying. So if we go back to the book that we have at our disposal, one of my great mentors used the expression, what's the best thing I can do today? What's the most excellent thing I can do today? And for me, like yesterday was a beautiful day here on the island, and I went out for a 3-hour walk with my wife. No camera, had my phone, I had a pair of binoculars with me. We walked around the coast. It was gorgeous. Did I see things I could have photographed? Sure. Did I photograph them? No, but I still noticed them. And one of the things I always say to my wife is that every photograph you take with your mind is perfect. You know, if you're in the landscape and you notice something that's cool and you don't make a photograph of it, the one you made in your mind is actually perfect. And what it does is it kind of teaches you to realize what you like. But passion, I just think we have unrealistic expectations of our behavior and our performance. You can't wake up in the morning every morning and be perfect. Some days you wake up and you're tired, you're lethargic, you've got things on your mind, there's stresses and strains of work, there's relationship issues, there's financial struggles, there's something up with our kids, there's any number of things. It can be blowing a gale outside in horizontal rain. There's so many things that we can't control. And something I get great inspiration from are listening to sports people or musicians, and the way they realize that we are variable and fluid and we can control small parts of what we do. But yeah, running a photography business, I think a lot of people have a very naive perception of how much work is involved. And if I think about my work, yes, I get to go out into the landscape and make photographs. And when I'm running workshops, actually, that's the easiest part of my life. We're very lucky with our participants. We almost never have a bad apple. Um, so, that type of thing is easy for me. Making YouTube videos is harder. It's you're screaming into the void. You got to play the game with that. But work is work. When I had my previous career in international finance, not every day was play. You have days that are just you got to get your head down and get on with it. So, you got to get paid, and getting paid means working. So, yeah, but passion it ebbs and flows. But again, you guys live by the ocean. You can walk down to the beach and watch the ebb and flow. And as soon as you lose yourself in that ebb and flow and realize how closely the waves interacting with the rocks of the shoreline mirror these ebbs and flows in your passion, then all of a sudden you find things to photograph and lose yourself in that mindlessness. So yeah, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves. So I'm pretty good at not doing that now.
Awesome. That's an amazing answer to one question, and away he goes. Anybody else got some questions? Please, someone? Oh, up the back. Tim? I'm coming. Got to take the mic all the way to the back. Hang on a sec.
No worries.
Yeah, hi. By the way, excellent photos. Do you see photographs not just as business, but like a study in your work?
Yeah. I think photography can tick any number of boxes for us, which is why I made this point early on of saying, why do you make photographs? During the pandemic, I did a lot of mentoring, and some of that mentoring was people who wanted to develop their craft, who wanted to become better photographers. And other people were hopelessly agoraphobic, mental wrecks, panic-stricken, socially dysfunctional people who wanted to use their creativity to become whole again. And that is a pretty huge spectrum, from photography as creative therapy to photography as an expression of competence. And what inevitably happened was that the people who were nervous wrecks were creating photographs that were unbelievably expressive. They were expressing all sorts of negative emotions incredibly articulately. And the people who were focused on becoming more craft-like had to break the barrier or break the label between why they thought they were making photographs and why they were actually making photographs. And ultimately what happened was that everybody started to join the dots between personal development and creative development. And I believe those two things walk hand in hand. Creativity is a function of personal development. Now, photography as a study of a thing is interesting. So my body of work, the Gobi body of work, Out of Darkness, that is a study of an environment. Yes, it's showing many, many facets of that one environment. So it's a study of sand, it's a study of rhythm, it's a study of time, it's a study of time of day, of geometry, of obviously contrast and atmosphere. It's a study of the attributes of a place, but equally it is the study of the inside of my head. And I'm more interested selfishly and narcissistically on having a better relationship with myself. That I think is, for me, the number one reason why I do anything, which is to grow as a person. And so I tend to get to the point now where most of my photography, I would consider it to be autobiographical. I think photography is an autobiographical art form of somehow saying, this is a representation of something I think is beautiful or emotionally somehow expressive. I don't believe we should be limited to making pretty photographs. I believe we should be allowed to make challenging photographs, just the same as musicians make challenging music, or artists or painters produce challenging pieces of work. So yeah, I think photography can tick any number of boxes, and understanding what box you want to tick. I quite like architectural photography. I like that as a study of form, but I can't divorce that from the study of myself either. So yeah, I'm fascinated by form. I'm fascinated by the qualities of the world around me. And I guess in answer to your question, all photographs are somehow a study of a subject, but I tend to think the subject is myself.
Cool answer. It's interesting that the pandemic produced a lot of people starting to think about themselves, so maybe that was a plus that we might not realise for a little while.
Yeah.
Anybody got any other questions? You've gobsmacked them, Alister. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. We really appreciate the time you've put in for this, and the fact that you're, as we said, sitting in your office on the other side of the world drinking coffee, talking to these strange Kiwis. I love the fact that you dropped the Mariki boulders and we could actually imagine you sitting there looking at the clouds from here, even though you're sitting up in the north of Scotland. So you projected it really well, and we thoroughly appreciated you speaking to us and the message that you told. Thank you again.
Worries. You're more than welcome. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, cool. Thanks, I didn't hear that. Can we say that again, please?
Sorry, yeah, I didn't realize there was going to be a clap.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure. And yeah, I think this is the furthest apart I've ever been from a Zoom audience before. So that's pretty cool.
Oh, well, you can put it down as a usefully spent Wednesday morning then. Thank you again.
Yeah, totally.
And go for a walk and have a good look out in the sun. I hope it's a nice sunny day out there.
It's not.
Well, there'll be some photographs to find out there in that case.
No doubt. Listen, thank you so much again. I appreciate the invite.
Thank you again. Goodbye.
Take care.
That was impressive. Do we have a set challenge? I mean, MDC, John? Not tonight. Okay, so it'll have to be kind of 2 weeks away then. Yeah, that's cool. Okay. Righto. As I said, we're just going to finish off with some notices and bits and pieces now. Upcoming notifications. Firstly, next week the hall's unavailable, and so there is dinner at Daphne's restaurant on the Thursday night rather than the Wednesday night. Hand-in's coming up 24th of July, that's the week after. Natural History Prints, and 31st, the week after that, that's Open Print number 4, and the week after that, AVs on the 7th of August. And then towards the end of August, on the 21st of August, is PI number 7, which is Landscape. That's what's coming up. So I hope you all enjoyed that. I thought it was fantastic, and I'm going to watch it again, I think, and have a really good think about what he said. So well and truly worth it. I would just like to pass on a couple of thanks to finish things off. Firstly, for Dennis for opening the venue up and getting supper and all that sort of stuff. For the boys up the back in the box for the comms, and for Gordon in particular setting up the Tim. You just waving at me, or have you got some? Okay, wave back, cool. Gordon set up the speaker system, so that worked much better with them, and I think that worked really well, so thanks for that. And yeah, that's basically it. Before we go, there's 3 things I want you to think about each time when it comes to packing up. There's lots of things that has to happen to get this club to work, and here's 2 or 3 real simple things that would help the people tidy up. First of all, if there's any cups loafing around, have a good look, spot them, pick them up, go and put them back in the area for Dennis. There's chairs and tables and things that had to get moved to get set up, so if we can just pick up the chairs and tables and put them back before you go. That really helps. And there's a sign outside that says CPS, tells us where to come in. Dennis has got a particular hate that he doesn't like wiping it when it's wet out there. So he's asking, can somebody go and grab it? And if it's wet, just wipe it off with some tea towels or tissues or some things from in the toilet. So thanks again. There's a few easy things to get involved. I hope you enjoyed tonight. I really did, and look forward to seeing you not next week, but the week after.